My friends, it's been way too long since I last reported on Ukraine. And because of your patience, I owe you a girthy update. Now that the mainstream media like the Washington Post finally accepted that the summer counteroffensive has failed, the new catchphrase is defense in depth. If I can be blunt, the reality is that the Russians are now attacking all over the front line, and they're making massive gains. In Avdiivka, although the Ukrainian troops are holding tight near Sverdne, Russian assault units are expanding their area of control north of the coke plant and west of the railway. Remember what I told you! We can't believe the Russians want to take control of this area in between both train tracks. Meanwhile, the Russian army is also increasing the heat in the industrial zone southeast of the city, and they could soon storm Avdiivka proper. At this point, only the immediate intervention of the 69th NATO Desktop Brigade can save Ukraine from losing Avdiivka.
Fuck.
Meanwhile, in Bakhmut, Bakhmut, when the nostalgia kicks in. And just like I told you in my previous video, the Russians are putting pressure on Avdiivka. They will be increasingly pushing out of Bakhmut. The Russian army is in the process of undoing all the Ukrainian gains they have achieved since May, north of the city. Ukraine should worry because Russia is clearly preparing the ground for large-scale operations against Chasiv Yar. In other words, not only did the Russian Ministry of Defense plagiarize Wagner's assault detachments, but they also plagiarized their battle plan for Bakhmut. I promise you I came up with all this by myself. The Russians are indeed increasing the pressure on our beloved Ukrainskaya Armia. The question remains, how will Ukraine be able to hold off the Russians on multiple fronts? As Ukraine is losing popular support in the West, and with diminishing Western weapon deliveries. To this effect, German newspaper Der Spiegel wrote Der endlose Krieg, the war without end. As a matter of fact, after Germany sent Ukraine dozens of Leopard 2A6 and Leopard 2A4s, they're now sending some Leopard 1A5s.
Yo!
And I love the mental gymnastics of the Western media that praises these tanks from the 1960s.
Get it right, bro. Actually, the Leopard 1A5's retrofitting process started in 1986. As the Bundeswehr added a Krupp Atlas electronic MS-18 fire control system, thermal imaging, and improved ammunition.
Okay, upgraded in the 1980s. At this rate, the West will send Ukraine some high-tech refurbished, eco-friendly, horse-drawn artillery. Welcome to History Legends, and here are the latest news of the Russo-Ukraine war. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. As you know, some of my Ukraine videos have been targeted with limited or no ads. So make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal to keep the show running. Thank you to everyone that has already helped, and welcome to the headquarters. Oh, by the way, I almost forgot. I just released a documentary on Napoleon's last battle, Waterloo, where I analyzed the entire campaign from an operational perspective. Essentially the same format that I used for Russia-Ukraine, but flashback to 1815. If you're interested, the link is in the description below. Although a lot of decisive battles are currently taking place in Avdiivka, just because of the nostalgia. Let's start with Bakhmut, Artyomovsk. Bakhmut. The city is in ruins, but it's good enough to house thousands of Russian troops from the cold. With winter approaching, here's the type of muddy trenches soldiers have to live in. And then when it snows, all the mud becomes frosty. And this is how the troops on the front have to sleep. On the 12th of November, it seems the Russian army probed enemy defenses south of Yahidne. And to their surprise, they gained 1 kilometer during their attack. On the 15th of November, the telegram channel of the 93rd Mechanized Brigade wrote the following. Our artillery simply cannot cope. We have gone on the defensive. It's even starting to seem to me that Avdiivka was a diversionary maneuver, and all forces were brought down on the Bakhmut. And the reason behind this sudden increase of Russian shelling was soon revealed. The Russians reopened the Bakhmut front. The idea was to attack all along the front, to confuse the enemy on their true intentions. You know things are about to get serious when the guys waving Soviet flags are kneeling to pray before battle.
Преподобных Отец святых святителей и всех святых небесных сил. Аминь.
Аминь.
Встать.
That's how, on the 28th of November, Russian assault units quickly took control over the forested hills north of Bakhmut, and the next day they stormed the village of Hromove. That same day, they also launched a well-coordinated mechanized assault towards Bohdanivka. We're lucky we have a little sample of this attack. As you can see on screen, there are 4 Russian BMPs supported by a tank. Together they pushed across a field north of the train tracks that you can see at the bottom of the screen. Group 1 disembarked 14 riflemen near this burnt vehicle, whereas Group 2 disembarked 14 riflemen as well, just a little bit further. Essentially, this consists in a platoon-sized unit. If we try to geolocate their position on the map, Group 1 was disembarked somewhere here, and Group 2 near this tree line right here, meaning the objective was to secure this forested area. The next day, they mopped up the Ukrainian positions along the tree line, forcing its defenders to retreat into Bohdanivka. After a 4-day pause, the Russians went back on the offensive on the 4th of December, and this time they took partial control over an area nicknamed the Nursery Farms. And if you pay attention, it's positioned right in front of the forested area they had just captured a couple days before, along the railway between Bohdanivka and Hromove. Simultaneously, the Russian army engaged the Ukrainian positions on this hilltop near the Road of Death. Then they pushed roughly 1 kilometer in between the villages of Bohdanivka and Hrihorivka. And the next day, they advanced some more with a couple assault squads in the direction of Bohdanivka. And according to the latest news, Russian forces are only 100 meters away from the first houses of that village, according to Syriac maps. This means with the latest Russian advances west of Bakhmut, 85% of the positions lost in May have been recaptured. In just a couple days! And this is the Russian warm-up set! From a tactical level, we can clearly see how the Russians intend to flank Bohdanivka from all sides. We can expect them to push down this slope and get a foothold in this tree line, from where they could push further along this other tree line, or even towards this forest. At the same time, we can expect them to continue their attempt to get a foothold inside the village. Lastly, they will most likely storm this hilltop in order to take control of these tree lines, from where eventually they can flank Bohdanivka. From an operational level, the goal is to push towards Chasiv Yar, with the Seversky Donetsk Canal as intermediary objective, as the Russian armed forces are pushing west of Bakhmut. In the first days of December, their artillery also bombarded, heavily smashed the fortified position overlooking Kleshivka. They literally fired everything they had in stock. And here you can see the use of incendiary munitions over the same area. Not surprisingly, the Russian 119th Regiment then successfully stormed the area on December 6th, where they reached the outside layer of this stronghold, which they then captured with a follow-up attack. If the Russians maintain control over this area, the Ukrainians will have to abandon Kleshivka. Many times, platoons of the 3rd Assault Brigade Azov were sent to counterattack the enemy in this lunar landscape, but on their own they couldn't stop the avalanche. I mean, I feel bad for these guys. They're literally the elite of the Ukrainian army. They lost so many guys to get control of all this area, and now it's all starting to crumble and to fall apart. What was it all for? And we can't forget that on the 6th of December, the Russians reconquered the Dacha area near the MiG monument that they had lost in June. We can clearly see that there's a massive Russian concentration of forces in this sector, from where they're flanking the entire Ukrainian positions. Furthermore, on a tactical level, we could be witnessing the restarting of operations against Ivanivske, a triple penetration from the north, west, and south, also in order to reach Chasiv Yar. That's when, on December 7th, the next day, the Russians decided to play some tiki-taka, as they ordered the 51st Regiment to push towards Vesele. And apparently, they captured 2 kilometers of ground. Right after that, Russian artillery started to get active near Zalizhnyanske, where they spotted and destroyed a nighttime rotation of the armed forces of Ukraine. At this moment, the Ukrainian HQ started to freak out. On the 22nd of November, the commander of the K2 battalion from the 54th Mechanized Brigade was interviewed by Ukrainian news agency Suspilny Noviny. He said that his battalion is deployed north of Solidar, probably in the sector of Razdolivka Vesely. When doing the interview, he did look concerned and called for a general mobilization of the Ukrainian population, claiming that many Ukrainian troops have been on the front line without rotation for months. And he complained that the Russians in his sector were 5 times more numerous, and that he feared an enemy attack. Not even 10 days later, his fears became reality. So, what can Ukraine do to stop this onslaught? Like what you can see on this deployment map, there are 14 Ukrainian brigades west of Bakhmut alone. If these units are at a third of their nominal strength, that's roughly 18 to 20,000 men spread out in all these tree lines and settlements. And if they're at full strength, we're talking about 56,000. According to Military Land, the 93rd Mechanized Brigade is deployed south of Bakhmut, most likely near Klishivka. Those were the guys complaining about the heavy Russian shelling. Military Land also talks about the 92nd Special Brigade. They're positioned near Ivanivske. And of course, there's the famous 3rd Assault Brigade Azov operating around Kordumivka. Here's a video of the 3rd Company of the 2nd Assault Battalion in combat in this sector. However, all these positions come from the same source, so we need to corroborate it with another external source. There was this French journalist on Twitter called Guillaume, and he went to visit Ukrainian troops on the front line near Bakhmut. On the 25th of November, he posted the following: "Scenes of utter devastation. Our friend Vitaly, a soldier of the 17th Tank Brigade of the Ukrainian Army, made a rather incongruous discovery." Now, according to the deployment map, the 17th Tank Brigade is positioned near Chasiv Yar. So yes, they're indeed in the Bakhmut sector. According to the journalist's claims, this tank brigade is equipped with American M109 self-propelled howitzers, and they fire sometimes up to 250 shells a day. Very interesting, but sadly not everyone has access to that much ammo. Because Guillaume then went to speak with men of the 56th Motorized Brigade. It makes sense because according to the deployment map, they're deployed near Orikhovo-Vasilivka, right next to the 17th Tank Brigade. The French journalist interviewed a 120mm mortar crew from this 56th Brigade. When asked how many shells they fire a day, 24-year-old call sign Fritz answered, "It would be easier to tell you how many we fire in a month. On average, about 2 or 3 a day." They're probably using a Soviet-era 2B11 mortar. And we know that Ukraine for a while now has been running low on Soviet-era ammunition. Now, to close Guillaume's chapter, he also posted this picture which presented a strange foreshadowing. A pillar with the words "Donbass is Ukraine" written on it, but the letters are slowly fading away. Now let's take a look at the juicy things happening in Avdiivka. Honestly, it's getting serious there. According to this video, this assault unit is composed of former Wagnerians, and they're now preparing to storm the city. For weeks now, the Ukrainians have reinforced their positions north of Avdiivka in the coke plant. That's why in this video you can see a Ukrainian patrol inside the Avdiivka industrial area, while we hear Russian shelling in the background. Meanwhile, they also positioned a number of armored vehicles there. This video was geolocated right here, and this vehicle was most likely firing on Russian troops crossing over the railway tracks, because this area is in the hot zone, as a lot of Russian recon units managed to set foot in Stepove. In this video, we can see them hiding behind a wall, with a clearly visible Avdiivka coke plant at the back. If we try to geolocate their position, it would be somewhere in this area. You can see the wall here, the field behind them, the tree line, and the Avdiivka coke plant. In my opinion, they were most likely part of a recon party tasked to get a foothold in this tree line. In response, Ukrainians keep sending in armored vehicles, like this M2 Bradley, tasked to punish the enemy for their blind bravery. But no luck. Our boy Bradley got targeted by a Russian FPV. and then the crew just abandoned the vehicle. Check out the brilliant work of the UK intelligence services.
Powers by name, powers by reputation.
They claim that throughout November, Russia was losing nearly 1,000 casualties, KIA, or wounded per day. Of course, according to the Ukrainian General Staff. Meanwhile, the website Mediazona, financed by the BBC, confirmed 577 Russian fatalities in November for an average of 20 per day. If we take the ratio of 1 KIA for 5 wounded, that's 120 casualties per day and not 1,000. It's as if the Ukrainian General Staff is counting in girl inches. Anyway, as the Ukrainians are sending all their reserves to stop the encirclement of Avdiivka on the 19th of November, the Russians made significant gains southeast of the city against the 110th Mechanized Brigade. In one area, after breaking one stronghold after another, they finally reached the outskirts of the Tsarska Ochota restaurant. And on the other side, they stormed the Promka industrial area. To clear the sector from enemy troops, they carried armored raids with 4 to 5 tanks that rushed inside this industrial area at full speed, unleashing their load right into the face of the enemy, and then drive back. At the same time, we have footage of riflemen progressing through the rubble, like in this video where you can see the first-person shooter perspective of Russian soldiers in that same sector. Some claim that the quick progress of the Russians is due to their heavy use of cluster munitions. Maybe, but we have to remember that it's not that efficient in an urban environment. In my opinion, the main reason behind this Russian breakthrough is best portrayed by this following video. Russian miners managed to dig a tunnel 170 meters long, undetected, leading right behind Ukrainian lines. Then they placed a 500-kilogram explosive charge, which then allowed multiple assault squads to storm enemy fortifications. Even at a ratio of 1v1, the surprise effect allowed the Russians to get the upper hand, and then reinforcements poured into the area to consolidate the gains. Just like in Bakhmut after a 4-day break. On the 23rd of November, they stormed the water filtration station north of the Promka industrial sector. This marked a considerable morale boost, because these Ukrainian defenses had been present since 2014. Fun fact, Radio Free Europe published this article from 2017 and reported the following. Ukrainian soldiers have dug trenches and tunnels in the Promka industrial zone. The Russian-backed separatists have also dug into their positions on the other side of the front line. Who would have thought back in the days that such a major battle would take place in Avdiivka? The Ukrainians quickly counterattacked and the water filtration station is now in the gray zone. However, even if the Russians end up capturing this position, they would still have to cross the H20 highway and break through this forest, which is most likely filled with trenches in various defensive positions. Perhaps in the future, we could see a combined flanking maneuver to squeeze out the Ukrainian defenders of these woods. Then, during the 2 next days, the Russians continued their operations inside the Promka industrial zone. Every night, the Russians kept shelling the main supply route leading into the sector, thus diminishing the amount of ammunition and reinforcements the Ukrainians could send. Meanwhile, in this video, you can see a Russian tank pressing forward under the cover of an artillery barrage and literally smashing its way through the buildings. This operation was combined with another push north of the sector. Then it seems that the last Ukrainian troops have had enough and they simply abandoned the sector.
Our men are running from the battlefield! A shameful display!
That's how on day 4 of the operation, the Russian army achieved the full capture of the Promka industrial zone. And on day 5, they captured the quarry as well. In this video, you can see Russian troops inspecting the trenches they had just captured. This is when Ukraine knew they effed up. So they immediately dispatched reinforcements, namely battalions of the 93rd, 62nd, 61st, 88th, and 31st brigades. On top of that, the first M1A1 Abrams were spotted somewhere east of Ukraine. In total, Ukraine received 31 Abrams, just enough to form one US-sponsored tank battalion. But the unit to which they will be attached is still unknown. In my opinion, it will most likely be a unit positioned in the vicinity of Avdiivka. or the 17th Tank Brigade we mentioned near Bakhmut. After this tactical success, it was time for the Russians to pivot and strike somewhere else. That's when they ordered an artillery preparation against the tree line south of Stepove. Here you can see the result of the shelling of this Ukrainian trench. This was most likely done to pin down the Ukrainians while Russian units withdrew from the village. Then it was the Ukrainians' turn to bombard the Russians positioned along the train tracks north of Stepove. At this point, we can believe that the Ukrainian HQ was uncertain as to where the Russians would attack next. The enemy could either try again against Stepove or get a foothold in the Avdiivka coke plant. They could try to bypass the industrial area from the east. So this forced the Ukrainians to spread out their forces and wait for the Russians to reveal their intentions. As you can see in this video, the Russians launched more and more recon drones to fly over the coke plant. The Ukrainian command center knew something was up and decided to reinforce the suburban area east of the factory, which is composed of hundreds of individual homes, which could be relatively easy for Russian assault squads to infiltrate. In the end, on the 30th of November, the Russians decided to push once again towards Stepove, and this allowed them to control half the settlement. During one of these firefights, some units of the foreign volunteers intervened, and that's when a former Canadian Army officer named Brad Stratford was KIA. And this comes just 2 weeks after another Canadian that was KIA, Austin Lathlin-Bercier from the First Nations. Like I mentioned in my previous video, this sector is defended by the 47th Mechanized Brigade. We can see how this unit came face to face with enemy armored vehicles. On December 2nd, it started snowing more heavily in Avdiivka, and this means that the ground was now perfect for mechanized formations. By that time, the Russians had captured 3 tree lines, this one going into the village, part of this one, and the third one just 1 kilometer south of it. Now, the next objective was to flank this tree line to get right into Stepove. But as they stormed this position, an incident happened. You have a Russian fire team of 4 men telling Ukrainian soldiers inside a dugout to come out with their hands above their head. But the moment they went out, if I can use a euphemism, let's say the Russians were not as merciful. We don't have more information on what happened, but that's the tragedy of it all. In an attempt to halt the flow of Russian reinforcements flanking them, the Ukrainians carried once again intensive artillery strikes using cluster munitions around the railway, and they did so with deadly accuracy. Now, according to Ukraine reports, the Russian basis for all these attacks is Krasnohorivka, which is home to a huge concentration of manpower and equipment. And this is from where they dispatch assault teams and organize rotations. This base allows the Russians to respawn only 2.5 kilometers away from the front. By the 7th of December, the Russian army was in full control over the railway east of Stepove. The next step would be to push along these tree lines, and of course secure the settlement of Stepove and its surroundings. Once again, more and more Ukrainian armored formations were thrown into the battle. One of them was this Bradley fighting off the Russians that tried to infiltrate Stepove. If we try to geolocate it, here's the tree line, here's this row of houses, meaning the Bradley IFV was firing in this direction against enemy forces. Shortly after, surprise surprise, the Russians posted this video of a captured M2 Bradley, perhaps the same one we just saw. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian 53rd Mechanized Brigade is holding its positions pretty well in Sverne, most likely because the moment the Russians capture a position, the 53rd Mechanized Brigade immediately counterattacks and pushes them away. So the attacking force can't really get a foothold. Meanwhile, further south, as confirmed by German journalist Julian Röpke, Marinka has fallen after 20 months of fighting, and the Russians placed a little flag in celebration. That's all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to support my work, make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal. The link is in the description below.